Right in with this event.
No introductions. Alright. I guess this is like much more intimate than I imagined, so I kind of saw myself as droning on for 20 minutes, half an hour. But maybe I'll just make some very brief introductory remarks and then we can have a discussion. I know this got advertised a little bit as being an event about talking to someone who's lived on the South Coast. Answer questions, discuss things, we can talk about GDP and what it is. So I guess that would be my preference, to keep it less formal and less about me giving a speech, if that's alright with everyone. Anybody object?
Could you just give a little summary about JVP though?
Yeah, that's actually why I have this cheat sheet, because I can't rattle off facts about JVP, but basically JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace. It kind of grew out of a small group of people in the San Francisco Bay Area, maybe, I'm guessing 15 years ago, I don't actually know, probably around then, and since then it's grown into a very large organization and keeps getting larger. So just for example, I'm a member of the Western Massachusetts chapter of JVP, and we formed in this past July or August, and this was part of like a wave of organization. So it grew from, I think the number of chapters has increased by 50% just in the last couple of years or so. So JVP's principles, and these are boiled down, there's like more detailed statements you can find on the website or elsewhere. JVP stands for peace, equality, and human rights. It opposes bigotry and oppression. It seeks an end to the Israeli occupation. It supports peace in the Middle East. It supports the rights of refugees. It supports the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It makes a number of demands. These, I think, are specifically the demands associated with the BDS campaign, which are an end to the Israeli occupation and colonization of Arab lands occupied in June 1967, dismantling the wall, recognizing fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens to full equality, respecting rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties, as stated in UN Resolution 194. So those are kind of the general principles, but, or I shouldn't say but, I think of JVP more in terms of the kinds of things we do. And the kinds of things we do are, a lot of public activity, demonstrations, petitions, participation in boycott campaigns. Up in Western Mass, where I am, I think the first event we ever did was a grief circle. So this was around the time of the bombings in Gaza in July of last year, maybe August of last year. And it was just an idea where some people in the group wanted to get together with other people in the community in a non-politicized way and just share feelings of grief and so on. So that was our first event, and then we do certain things that are specifically connected with Jewish ritual, and we bring speakers in Western Mass. We have a book group, so we read a book relating to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we get together to discuss it. And at least where we are, it's a growing organization, and it's an exciting time, and people come in with different ideas about what we ought to be doing, and different energies and different resources, so we can make things happen. JVP, just to be clear, it's not a Jewish-only organization. I mean, we tend to do Jewish things, and by and large, the people who participate are Jewish, but it welcomes anyone who shares the core values of the organization. So that's basically my write-up of the JVP summary. I should say I think there's a every 2 years conference, biennial, and it just happened last month, and unfortunately I didn't get to go, so I don't have anything to report back about what the new exciting plans are. I have noticed more recently that JVP is getting a little bit more involved in like legislature level things, like the U.S. Congress in particular. So I know in Western Mass we are developing relationships with our senators, particularly Elizabeth Warren, not so much the other guy, and out in Western Mass. I think here it's also Jim McGovern, and that covers a bunch of territory in Western Mass. is also out there, but I don't know if talking to him. So that's it roughly on JVP. I suppose I was going to talk a little bit about myself also. I'm not American and not really Israeli either. I am Canadian. I've been living here in the U.S. for the last 15 years or so, ever since I came to UMass to pursue my graduate studies, and since then I've become a lawyer. So that's what I do all day, and my particularly relevant background is my mother is Israeli, my father is Canadian, and when I turned about 7, I grew up in Canada, but when I turned around 7, we moved back to Israel. Only wasn't really Israel. It was first we lived in Jerusalem, in a neighborhood in East Jerusalem that is called East Tapiot. The reason is there's a very well-known absorption center there, which is basically it's residential. It's a residential place, like a complex that accommodates I don't know how many dozens or hundreds of people, and it is either charitable or nonprofit or state subsidized. I'm not exactly sure which, and it's a place where new immigrants to Israel come before moving on. They live there temporarily before moving on to the final destination. And in reality, immigration tends to be directed, has since maybe the late 70s, early 80s, been directed towards the settlements. So you sometimes hear, the Israeli government is clamping down on settlement or is very critical of settlements. The reality is that the Israeli government is very much behind the settlement project. It just does it in such a way to make it, make it look like, oh, they're off there doing that, we're barely restraining them. But we're really committed to the principle of 2 states and the relevant United Nations resolutions. So the absorption center was filled with a lot of people like us who were getting ready to move to a settlement that was still in the process of being built right at that time. So the settlement that I lived in is called Efrat, and it's in the Etzion block of settlements, kind of south of Jerusalem, like at the edge of the Judean desert, south of Bethlehem, north of Hebron. For those to whom the geographical coordinates mean something, it's part of a group of settlements that was kind of built together in a planned sort of way. And this particular settlement was kind of the initiative of a group of liberal Jews from Manhattan, led by Rabbi Riskin, who's a very well-known, young, kind of idealistic rabbi who had this progressive congregation in the 1970s. And they were all, let's move to Israel and form a progressive community. And for whatever reason, they set up on a settlement. I don't know how intentional that was, or maybe because it was so much cheaper, because the Israeli government subsidizes settlements so much. I don't actually know. But it was very much geared towards like more affluent, professional Jews coming from like Manhattan. So there was a fair amount of it was practically an English-speaking settlement for one. And it was very loaded with immigrants, and it tended to be professional people who might have worked in Jerusalem. And, it was like a bedroom settlement in a sense. People would drive to Jerusalem for work and then drive back. The American angle, it expressed itself in some weird ways. So like as a Canadian, there's a type of person who, maybe it's a stereotype almost, but a type of person who I associate with a certain American subculture, gun crazies. So there were some people on the settlement who basically are the kind of people I think of as gun nuts. And that was really, it wasn't like, it's not an Israeli army, I've got my guns kind of thing. It really is like a certain type of ideological American gun crazy, and not the majority by any means. That kind of person might have not fit in perfectly well in the liberal synagogue in New York either. But because so many people were American, you kind of got different American types showing up there. So yeah, that's basically what it was. My dad worked in Jerusalem like a lot of other people, and we lived there for about 2.5 years, and eventually, for reasons just having to do with personal things and family economics and whatever, we decided to move back to Canada. So really, this is somewhere where I lived from about age 7 to age 10. So I think of Efrat as being the settlement that I lived on, but actually the place where I lived in Jerusalem was territory occupied in the 1967 war, and falls in that kind of same category for the purposes of United Nations resolutions and so on, as the settlement of Efrat does. So yeah, just trying to paint you a bit of a picture to give you some sense of what I'm talking about and maybe lead to some questions. I should add that I consider myself someone who knows much more than the average person about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on any particular thing, except maybe one thing, which is American nonprofit funding of settlements is a topic I've worked on a fair amount. So if that's something you're interested in, that's something I can probably speak to reasonably authoritatively. Otherwise, I could talk about my experiences and perceptions and things I've read, but not really as an expert. Am I missing something that I can't? Corey, am I missing anything I intended to talk about? JVP, settlement. I know this is part of the Israel Apartheid Week events. Maybe I could talk about that, but maybe that can emerge in the questioning, because I already saw a hand on it.
I was just gonna say, maybe I missed it because I'm so sorry. I was just coming from our talk upstairs. But like, what made you what made you stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people? Like, what transformed from growing up, in the settlement, and I don't know later when you said you moved to the U.S. after that, or when that happened. But what was kind of since then, like from that standpoint, like what happened? I guess.
Yeah, I knew I forgot something I was going to talk about. I always find that a tough question to answer, because my inclination is always to talk about it in rational terms, like, oh, I realized X and I learned fact Y, and it, that plays a role, but I don't trust people when they talk about their own motivations in terms of like, oh, I learned something and I realized something, because like, why didn't you realize it before? And I don't know myself well enough psychologically to really go on about that. But so I might just answer. I'll try to answer on both levels maybe. Part of it is I just saw contradictions. So again, I was living in Canada, and I was part of a community in Toronto. And Toronto is a very diverse and gigantic Jewish community. But the sub-community that I lived in it's kind of affiliated with a particular stream of the Israeli Zionist movement known as the Bnei Akiva movement, which we don't need to get into the details of it unless anyone's really interested. But it's kind of like a religious with an emphasis on modernist as opposed to really 19th century European pious religious observance. It's more like we live in the modern world, we go to universities, we get professional jobs. At the same time, we're very committed to Israel and Zionism. And I in fact went to the only high school outside of Israel that's affiliated with this organization. So I continued to be in very much the same kind of atmosphere. So it's just to say, my parents chose to move to the occupied territories largely for economic reasons, but it wasn't an ideological contradiction, like we were squarely in there. So I would go to school and we would study religious studies in the morning. Prayers started at 7:30, and then you study religious studies till about 1:30. And then the rest of the day until 6 or 6:30, you study your general math, geography, science, English literature, and so on, and French because it's independent. And it just became really clear to me that there was kind of like a contradiction between what I was learning in the morning and what I was learning in the afternoon. So, in the afternoon, we'd learn the Canadian multicultural curriculum, right? We learn and partly it's juxtaposed against the United States, right? So we learn all about American slavery, and like how Canada was a safe haven for refugee slaves. So you get like an overall picture of like tolerance, diversity, and this and that. And in the morning you study these, you study religious texts, which mostly have nothing to do with Zionism, but kind of fits in the story of religious Zionism, and it's made to fit in with the particular classes that you take. So you're kind of learning like very like nationalistic, almost chauvinistic religious stuff in the morning, and in the afternoon you get a multicultural curriculum. So really the question I have in mind is like why more people didn't shift in their views. So that was a little bit of it, and I wouldn't say I was definitely not a Palestine solidarity activist in high school, but I did things like start to question and adopt, I adopted a more universalist kind of point of view, and I would ask kind of general questions like, war seems like such a bad idea, it's so destructive, it's so wrong, like how come we're for it in the morning and like we're against it in the afternoon? And I, like personally, I really identified with like, I would have probably told you I was anti-war if you asked. And then really it was a matter of learning more after that. So like when I went to college and, I went to college, I started college in 1993, which is right when Oslo got signed. So that kind of defined a little bit the situation I was in. I also went to York University in Toronto, which is, it's an extremely politically mobilized campus, and it's an extremely diverse campus. I think native-born white Canadians might be something like 30% of the student body there. So it was like a totally different experience, and for me it was generally a really good experience where I got exposure to like lots and lots of things I did before. And I probably still was not, I wouldn't say I was a Palestine solidarity activist, although I was very critical of Israel in a lot of ways at that point. And I think what really did it is when I moved to the US in 1999, that was right before the second Intifada started. And by then I was kind of politically active on a bunch of other things, so I did what in Canada we would probably call anti-capitalist work, and here might be called anti-globalization, and anti-war in Iraq stuff and so on. And then when the second Intifada broke out, it was kind of a natural place for me to go, and I was a little bit taken aback, because at that time, I was going to Hillel all the time. I was on the meal plan at Hillel, so I was there every day, and I would go there for Shabbat dinners, and I would do this and that, and just like, and it wasn't very political. And then the second Intifada broke out, and it was like a polarizing moment, and I kind of knew what side I was on within that space, and that kind of caused me to, get more engaged and get more involved.
More of an internal, like within Judaism question, but regarding the studies you had in the morning with the school you were at. So you saw contradictions between the morning, like religious studies and all of that, and then the afternoon, more secular stuff. Did you see any contradictions, maybe even within the afternoon studies, but especially the morning studies, with like a lot of principles of sort of social justice, but then a lot of that being contradicted by more nationalistic, more violent like narratives?
Good question. So to the extent that I find any kind of like social justice inspiration in like the Jewish text and Jewish tradition, and remember again, I come from like an Orthodox background, so for me, like I see, the Reform movement has its social justice tradition. I don't really relate to that on a very basic level. Like I always liked the prophets. Those were the Jewish texts that really I could read and relate to. And we just didn't study a lot of them, because it's kind of like a hierarchy, like the Talmud is the most important thing, and then the Torah, the five books, Genesis through Deuteronomy, are maybe the second most important thing. And which is kind of strange, because the Torah was given to Moses, and the Talmud is like oral tradition, but that's a funny contradiction, but never mind that. And the prophets, you know, it was always kind of a core subject, but it's like the last core subject. And so it's not something we dwelled on a lot. But to the extent that we did dwell on it, I guess I did see it as a contradiction, but I've always kind of thought in Judaism, like in any religion that's gone back for a while and had a lot of text, there's so many contradictions, and that's why you get in every religion, you know, crazy people using text to justify all kinds of horrible things at the same time that you find, you know, really social justice oriented people finding, you know, texts of equal authority in the same religion standing for what they believe in. So kind of those internal contradictions within the religious canon never really particularly bothered me. But they're there.
I'm still learning about JVP, and I'm wondering, you know, as a Jewish organization, but yet for the Palestinian people and for the Palestinian rights, how is there any sort of Zionist idea of there should be a land for the Jews, or is there like, is it for, you know, a two-state solution of recognizing both peoples? How does that fit into the JVP narrative, if at all?
I think JVP is intended to be more of a big umbrella that allows, you know, accommodates both people who believe in two states and people who believe in a one-state solution, who believe in a zero-state solution. And I think, I mean, it could be hard to really pin it down because, like, you look at the list of principles that I stated at the beginning, and, you know, people read ultimate goals into them, and to some extent maybe that's inevitable. So, like, you know, it says respect the rights of refugees. Does that contradict the possibility of a two-state solution? I mean, it might depend on how it's implemented. And you know, a lot of times you get criticism on that kind of basis, like, oh, you're in favor of one state, that means you're, you know, against Jewish right to a state and everyone else. Or you're in favor of two states, you're not in favor of the rights of refugees, or for that matter, Israeli settlers or Palestinian Arabs living in what would be the Israeli state. So I think the idea is to be a more bigger umbrella organization than that. And I like that because I personally really don't get bogged down in ultimate solutions. I'd much rather talk about, like, how can we make progress, whatever way it gets done. A lot of friends of mine like to have theoretical debates, and it's not for me. So that's why I think JVP is for me. Yeah.
Well, I think, like, kind of like bouncing off that, like, it's not like JVP could, like, realistically, like, oh, they're gonna set the terms of peace. So it's like, why, like, don't make those demands if you have, like, methods that could move, that they see as moving forward.
Yeah. Seize the opportunity. Are you raising your hand again?
Well, I guess because I'm wondering if there's any insistent in JVP's, you know, demands of also having a Jewish state. Like, and that was where my question was within, is because I didn't hear those, and that's why I was wondering if that existed, or if the focus is not on that, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I don't think JVP says we support a Jewish state or we support a Palestinian state.
Right, it might not be, it's more on the ideals.
Yeah, I think that's right, but like I said, I had to write down the principles because I'm not that conversant in them. So don't take my word for it, go look it up on the website. Yes?
Actually, I wanted to talk to that. I also don't know the values of JVP by heart, but I did get to see the executive director talk at a conference a few months ago, and it was sort of like a debate session, or kind of like there were 4 people. So there was her, Rebecca, can't pronounce that word. And there was someone from J Street, and there were 2 journalists who were kind of like aligned with J Street or aligned with JVP, and the debate was kind of like 1 state versus 2 state. go at it. And they were, all four of them were American, and JVP is an American organization. So J Street was doing, we support a two-state, this is why, blah, blah, blah. The two journalists were saying their thing, and then Rebecca went on, she said kind of like, why is it up to us to decide? Like, we're American. And I was kind of sitting in the audience, I was like, thank you, because it was really weird to hear for Americans, like, talk about your country, like, deciding what it should be. And I think that was a good perspective. And I think that's probably part of why, like, JVP doesn't have, like, a stance, because it is an American organization. So I think it's more about supporting what you think is just and less about, giving your conditions to what should happen in a country that's not yours. I mean, obviously they're mostly Jewish, so they probably have an opinion about a Jewish state, but as an American organization, it's a little bit weird to like make demands. Like, I'm not gonna be like, friends should be this way, because I don't know. So I think that, I really like that you said that, like, remember that.
Yeah, the demands are more about like the general human rights principles than about specific like political solutions or like diplomatic solutions.
Yeah, rights-based rather than states-based. We've talked about that other times at like BDS conflict, like different stuff. Anyway, the best way it was explained to me was that you can have a 1-state, 2-state, 3-state, 4-state, whatever state, no state. But at the end of the day, we need to be looking at, you could have a 1-state, you could have 2-state, 3-state, whatever. But are people's human rights fully being respected? So again, going off of that, like, it's not only not our place, specifically as like American activists, but also like even regardless of like the actual implementation, it needs to be a rights-based approach and not a state-based approach, because you can have 2-state, 1-state, so on and so forth, and it can still Israel, because of its major occupying power and is one of the most powerful militaries, will find a way probably to navigate that to still circumvent recognizing the full and equal rights of Palestinian people. So I think just going off of that state rights-based and not states-based approach.
So I have always felt like I have only recently learned that you cannot be Jewish and be in Jewish Voice for Peace, which is exciting. But my religious home is with Unitarian Universalists, and I know that within there's a group called Youth for Justice in the Middle East, and I know there are other religious organizations in other religions that, in terms of sort of their intra-religious organizing, focus on BDS, and I think that's what UUJME does as well. And I found usually when I talk to any kind of, like, most Jews who are generally very progressive about BDS, they sort of huff and puff and leave the room. And so I'm curious if you do organizing within Jewish communities and what it looks like. And I'm also curious if you draw part of, I think, like, sort of the only successful, like, UU organizing that I've seen has been around Palestine, has been on the border with Mexico and has been connected with, like, immigration in the state and talks about American colonialism. And I'm curious if JVP does anything like that.
So on the first question, I really can only speak to what JVP does in my local chapter,
Yeah.
and the answer is it's something we stated at.
What do you do?
Well, we stated at the outset we want, one of our goals is to organize within the Jewish community, and it's not something that we've done a lot of yet. We've been mostly doing like getting the chapter in order and chapter building and hosting a couple of events. I think the concept is to organize within the Jewish community, which in Western Mass is in large part college community, but also in we have a small number of synagogues. We're mostly an Upper Valley organization, so like Springfield has a large Jewish community also, and the towns around Springfield. But that's kind of like separate from where we are up more in the Amherst, Northampton, South Hadley area. So we haven't per se done a lot of that, it's just something that we're starting to do. And I don't think I know the answer to your second question. Is it specifically about cross-border, or is it about particular?
Yeah, well, like the first resolution to be introduced to the UU General Assembly about divestment came from a church in Tucson, which is the home of Numas Nortes. And so it was actually like hosting that organization, which tries to stop people from dying in the desert, that sort of like led that church to a more radical analysis of the occupation. And so they do stuff about like, you know, the two walls and
I guess the answer is not to my knowledge,
yeah.
but then I don't think there's a big Jewish community in Tucson. I know there's an Israeli community out there, but I don't think there's a big American Jewish community
I don't know.
or any other border community that immediately comes to mind. What's that?
It's like a medium, as far as I understand, it's a medium Jewish community.
In Tucson?
There is one, but
Okay.
And
not
the-
huge, it's not
I
New
guess I
York,
didn't
but
know.
to my knowledge.
It's a big city.
Yeah.
Can you speak more to, you said you've done a lot with the NGOs, so can you speak more to like the more prominent NGOs that support the settlements and give funding the settlements?
Oh, yeah, prominent ones. There is the Hebron Fund, which is a pretty big one.
This is all American.
These are all American NGOs that send money over to settlements or to organizations in settlements that directly benefit the settlements. That's one of them, and the ones that I think of as prominent tend to be the ones that do like a lot of fundraising events and get a lot of publicity in the U.S., as opposed to some which are just, you know, some wealthy individual donor who sets up a foundation and sends money overseas without getting a ton of publicity, doing a ton of fundraising. There's the American Friends of Ateret Kohanim, which sort of presents itself as a group supporting a religious seminary, but is actually dedicated to Judaizing parts of Jerusalem. So the old city of Jerusalem, in particular, the parts that have had historically a Jewish presence, the fund will do things like buy houses from Christians and Muslims for resale to Jewish people. That's kind of the thing that they do. But they also sometimes do aggressive physical takeovers of people's houses.
How do they do that? Sorry,
How
I'm
do
talking
they-
about that later.
How do they do it?
Yeah.
The way they've done it, you mean aggressive takeovers? They obtain a deed, usually it's controversial whether it was legitimately obtained or not, for the property. And then they get some soldiers and knock on the door and say, this is our house, here's a deed, and physically evict whoever's living there. That's not the only organization that does this, but and again, it's very strategically targeted. So you know, a particular, and this is all done in East Jerusalem, the part that's, you know, if you consider the 1967 wall that was conquered there to have a different status. This is all like 1967 conquered territory, so it's kind of like a strategic settlement of strategic areas. There's some other prominent ones. There's Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, which is a Colorado-based evangelical Christian organization. So there's lots of Christian charities that you know support the people of Israel out of religious motives. But Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is especially focused on settlements. They only operate on settlements pretty much. there is the Central Fund of Israel. There's a couple, the One Israel Fund and the Central Fund of Israel, both of which do a lot of fundraising, and they're more umbrella type organizations, so you can pick a particular project in Israel, a particular Israeli nonprofit, and direct your donation to them. They're somewhat well known because at least some of the organizations they fund basically arm settlers. So you're not going to support, a hospital on a settlement. You're actually going to, you can earmark it towards supporting buying weapons and
That's
doing
not what
training.
Like,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
where does that money go specifically in the settlements?
Different organizations have different things. So sometimes it's things that would be considered legitimate and charitable, if not for them being on the settlement, like schools is a big one, medical services, things like that. Sometimes, a lot of times you just can't trace where it goes because there's not a lot of oversight of nonprofits, and to the extent that there's oversight, they're really interested in things like, do you have a conflict of interest policy, and is your paperwork all in order? It's not so much what exactly are you doing. So for example, the Hebron Fund, we know that a ton of money goes to the community there. Not exactly clear what it ends up doing. And that's an organization that has like a newsletter and this and that, but it doesn't specifically say, this particular project is supported by money received from the American nonprofit. It just says, here's a bunch of things we're involved with. And in some cases, there is training of paramilitaries. A famous example is, who's old enough to remember Jack Abramoff? Anybody? A couple of people. So he's mostly known for being a totally corrupt lobbyist, but one of his projects, and he was like a big supporter of the settlements, he set up a charitable organization in Maryland, which supposedly was like helping buy sports equipment for underprivileged kids in Maryland, but a lot of it was going to ship boxes of weapons and ammo to Israel. And that all kind of emerged during the congressional hearings where he was investigated, and that's an example of an organization that got disqualified for being engaged in illegal activity. Maybe the only one organization of this kind that's ever been disqualified by the IRS for not meeting the charitable purposes of the nonprofit laws.
I don't know if people are familiar with the Hebron Fund and specifically what
The Hebron is-
happens in Hebron.
Yeah. So Hebron's kind of, it's interesting. So I think it might have been the very first settlement, the first attempt at settlement. So what we call settlements are basically Jewish communities that are set up in the area that Israel conquered, the area of Palestine usually, that Israel conquered in 1967. Although there are also settlements in the Golan Heights as well, which is part of Syria. But Hebron has like a lot of historic significance for Jewish people, and also it's the look. There's a big grievance that people have, which is there used to be a largish Jewish community in Hebron, and then around the time that tension really started between the Zionists and the Palestinians in the 1920s, there was a series of events, including one in which a group of Jewish people got killed. There might have been like 100 or more people, and that was really one of the hot points where the conflict really heated up. And after that happened, the British, who were the colonizer at the time, evacuated the Jewish community out of Hebron. So it's always kind of been like a Zionist ideal, like we're going back. And really, I think it was the first Passover after the 1967 war, so we're talking maybe April of 1968, a group of religious settlers basically went in and said it's Passover. They told the Israeli government, which at the time did not have a pro-settlement policy, we're going to Hebron, we're going to celebrate Passover there, and then we're leaving. Actually what they intended to do was to stay and permanently settle there. And if I remember correctly, they eventually got evacuated by the Israeli government, but what they did was they regrouped and maybe a year or two later set up in Kiryat Arba, which is just outside Hebron, but basically kind of in the historic district. And this is not like the middle of a Palestinian city. This was just like a nearby hilltop where a settlement got set up. So that became, again, one of the first actual permanent settlements, possibly the first one that actually was not evacuated. And it's kind of known for extremism. So, some settlements are like not really political in the sense that the people living there are like, we're just living here. Kiryat Arba and Hebron are not like that. It's very ideological people who, among some of their listservs, and it talks about how to expand Jewish sovereignty, how to prevent the rise of the Palestinian state. It's that kind of situation. So I mentioned Kiryat Arba, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I think Kiryat Arba might be a settlement of maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. And since then, a settlement has actually been set up inside Hebron. So apart from the Kiryat Arba settlement, there's kind of this offshoot of that which came into Hebron, which is a Palestinian city of about 130,000 people. And they basically live like in a little armed enclave within this Palestinian city. So there's Israeli soldiers guarding it nonstop. It's a gated community with gates that like open one way. So like you can't get in unless you, without passing through the army, but you can get out. And it's a little bit insane. So there are places where like the gate is vertical, so you get top level of some buildings, you get settlers there, and on the bottom levels you get Palestinians living there. But for the most part, Palestinians were just cleared out entirely from the area around this settler enclave. So you could be living there, but you get evacuated, for security purposes to avoid clashes. And really, it's like the whole city, much more so in the areas that are near the settlers, but really the whole city is basically under kind of non-stop military harassment. So, and the reason and/or excuse is settlers are there. There's always skirmishes. Very often, settlers just go out and vandalize stuff, which causes issues. So the army will go, and if they suspect that you're the person who attacked a settler, your house can be raided in the middle of the night, and the whole family gets woken up, and your house gets ransacked while they're looking for evidence and so on. So it's just, I think it's really the only situation where you've got a Palestinian city and you have a settlement inside of it, and it's usually destabilizing. And a lot of it really is ideologically driven. They're usually not armed clashes in the sense of guns, but it has gotten to that point once or twice. And the settlers are so extreme that the Israeli president basically was calling them pogromists a few years ago. Ever know what a pogrom is? So they're considered very extreme even by settler standards and certainly by Israeli standards. And they're very much about expanding their foothold in the city by constantly harassing everyone else in the city. So they do a lot of fundraising. They have a lot of supporters in New York and New Jersey in particular. That's where they hold their annual fundraisers. And there's no question really about what the money's going to do. But if you try to actually connect the dots, you probably have to do an audit of the organization.
So this is like what's it called, the Hebron Fund?
Yeah.
Isn't Hebron just the Hebrew name though? Like
It's Khalil.
Thanks for Khalid, yeah.
I'm also wondering, since you lived in Canada, now you live in the US, is there a disparity between the Jewish populations in Canada and the US and how, like, I know in America it's very conservative compared to most places
In terms of politics, like with Zionism.
with Zionism?
I don't know. I mean, I've kind of lived in different types of communities in Canada versus the US. So when I was, I went to college in Canada, I lived at home, I still lived in the same kind of community that was a particularly Zionist one. I lived in Vancouver for a couple of years. But it was the Oslo years, so people weren't really talking about it much. In the US, I live in a liberal college area with a lot of radical people, so I don't know if my experiences are representative. I don't know that there's a big difference. My impression is there's not a big difference between Canadian Jewish and the US Jewish community. There probably is a big difference between the general Canadian population and the general American population, I would say. Just like there is, do you support X war? I think the Canadian public is more likely to be opposed to any given war than the American public. Even the ones Canada isn't. So like the Afghanistan, Canada got involved in the Afghanistan war and it was quite unpopular for many years, I think much more so than it was in this country. So it's a war where both countries actually sent troops, but it was a lot less popular in Canada. Yeah.
So, what are your strategies and how what's worked best in terms of educating other Jewish people and engaging them in the community? And my second question is, do you have accountability relationships with Palestinian people? Meaning, do you have some way of receiving feedback or deferring to Palestinian leadership?
Talking about JVP or me personally?
Both.
I don't really have a strategy for organizing Jewish community because it's not something I really focus on. But personally, my approach is, the task in the U.S. is to change the attitude of the U.S. government primarily, but also the American public. And it's not about primarily convincing Jewish people. JVP takes a bit more of a let's organize within the Jewish community approach, which I haven't really been involved in and we haven't really started yet, at least where I'm at. So I'm not really sure what works and what doesn't. And I don't think that there's any, I don't know.
Counterpoint to that is upstairs. The acapella group.
They're warming up.
It's
just a wall.
So yeah, I wouldn't say we have a built-in accountability mechanism.
How awesome JVP is, like, angels start singing.
But a lot of what we have been doing is turning out for other years' events.
Can I close the door?
You think that would
I don't know if
It's
I'm.
coming from upstairs.
You're gonna hear it.
You need better insulation.
So I've been told this event doesn't have a set end time, that I can make it last as long as I want. Do you all want refreshments before we keep going?
Actually, I'm gonna get some pita chips.
You can like stay at 8 hours.
Okay.
We could also do like a
really
5-minute break so people don't feel
Chips are amazing.
speaking to leaving if they feel like leaving.
Yeah, I do kind of have to. I want pita chips.
5 minutes.
Did you go to the Banana camp too?
No, my brother was like a counselor. No, actually he was a kitchen guy. We couldn't really afford it, it was like expensive to go in.
Because I grew up in Havanna, and whenever I grew up at one of the camps called Moshe, and then
Which much of it?
the one in Maryland,
Okay.
near Baltimore.
There's one in Peterborough, Ontario.
Yeah, that's Gotcha. That's just, oh, sorry, I didn't go on.
So you were out in Western Mass, yeah? What students do you work with primarily? Is it UMass, or is it Hampshire?
Oh my god.
We haven't really started much, to the extent that students are involved, it's Hampshire.
Yeah.
Right.